This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien kicks off today's show with this week's grain market outlook. He recaps a few key points from the Ag Outlook Conference that are valuable to Kansas crop growers. Continuing the show is a keynote speaker from the Women Managing the Farm Conference, Kim Bremmer. Kim talks about the importance of people in agriculture consistently sharing their story with others. Chip Redmond, K-State meteorologist, rounds out the show with a weather update. He says how Kansans should be expecting continued increased wildfire risk. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market outlook with K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Dan, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Dan, kicking off our grain conversation with what are futures looking like?
Well, we've continued to move lower in the futures markets. And I think, although we're mainly talking about futures now, when you look around at Kansas basis levels, they're certainly not giving any hidden signals that there's a groundswell of demand welling up out there. The general idea in the markets is that there's not, at this point in time, a great need for agribusinesses, exporters, you name it, to come buying grain. Because of that weakness has come from the cash markets to affect the futures. So we dropped down to some levels that if we looked at this over the last 2 or 3 years, we'd be astounded that we'd be here right now. Yesterday's close on the March contract, 406, down touching on almost at $4. It traded as low as 404 and a quarter. New crop is still at 453 and a quarter. Historically, pretty good price, not too bad a price, but given where we're at right now, and we're down close to the $4 level, that's a sign of certainly a buyer's market and not a seller's market. Soybeans have also weakened. The March contract, March 24, closed below 1150, 1147 and 3/4, down 13 cents yesterday. New crop November, 1135. So still you have the new crop, the ratio of November at 1135 to D's at 453, still showing some advantage to the planting of soybeans in the heart of the U.S. Corn Belt this year. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. And for wheat, we've seen hard red winter wheat close yesterday at 574 in the March contract, July 566, and that down 2 or 3 cents. So just a very, very weak time in the grain markets. On the future side, we do have the impending rollover from the March contract into the May, and try to watch where futures positions are. For instance, for March corn contract versus May, you've got volume of 274,000 contracts in the March, 556,000 in the May. So some of that rolling has already happened. And for soybeans, that's the other big one we'd be watching. You've got a similar situation where you got 154,000, 5,000 bushel contracts that are still in what they call open interest. Then 318 or so in the May. That'd be the March contract for May. So we're starting to see the market as we get into the last part of February starting to do this rolling already. And the one that affects us probably very, very directly would be the wheat contract. And really most of that rolling's already happened. The volume is a lot less, 24,500, 5,000 bushel contracts in the March, open interest in March. And already you're looking out to May, 106,000. So almost 4 times as many contracts apparently have gotten out of the March contract already into the May. So it wasn't but a week or so ago when you hadn't seen that much rolling. And I guess for this old cash market oriented Kansas State guy, I'm somewhat surprised that we had that much rollover, that much turning, people getting out of those short positions, buying back longs, and yet the futures are still sideways to lower. So it just is what it is.
And Dan, last week we talked that you were in D.C., and so I've had a little bit more time to develop that information and another day of knowledge from the Ag Outlook Conference, and a few things you wanted to share with us from that.
Three things. First of all, probably the most important info coming out of this is probably their estimate of where acres are going to go. And going forward, we'll have on March 8th, the next WASDE report. We'll find out largely about South America on that. But then on March 28th, we have the prospective plantings report. So we got that. We also have the balance sheets. They came out with balance sheets for the major crops for what interests us in Kansas. Corns, grain, sorghum, soybeans, and wheat, and then their price numbers also. So first of all, for acres, the USDA basically looked at the soybean to corn new crop price ratio and in essence projected that we'd be down 3.6 or so million acres for corn down to 91 and up 3.7 million acres for soybeans up to 87.5, sorghum sideways to slightly lower down about 200,000 acres, all wheat, not just hard red, down about 2.6 million acres, again 5, 6, 7%, something like that. Cotton actually up, so that might affect us in Kansas. And rice unchanged. We don't grow a lot of rice here in Kansas, but still it has an impact in different places. So those are now the standard for comparison in the market when we come into that March 28th report. Last year, I just remember the big surprises we had when we went from the March to the June 30th report, and the USDA almost completely reversed course, and then raised their corn acres, dropped their soybean acres, and I know what the soybean to corn price ratio as an indicator of relative profitability stands for. Understand it, got it. But there's also the issue of what farmers are best at. What's their comparative advantage? And we're pretty strong at growing corn too. So that'll be a big issue. These balance sheets, in essence, for corn, they projected 181 bushels per acre. The record we've ever had was last year's 2023 crop and 177.3. So that's a long-term beeline trend. And I take that number and it comes in at 15, little over 15 billion. If you plug in this year's record, 177.3, this is the U.S. average yield, you end up at about 14.6 or 7 billion bushels. And you end up and whittle ending stocks down from the USDA's projection with 181 down to their projected ending stocks at about 2.5 billion bushels. If you go with the other record here, 177, you're down about 2.1. This is about where we're at this year. Of course, stocks to use are way high in those scenarios. The corn price this year still projected at 480. They project next year's corn price at 440. So all those are pretty sobering numbers for U.S. corn producers. The other side of that would be for soybeans. The USDA projected another near record soybean yield as well, 52 bushels per acre, 4.5 billion bushels of production, record high as I understand it, and ending stocks growing from 315 this year, which are already somewhat burdensome. We see it by the prices, to a high of up to 435. Stocks to use close to 10. Probably the most noteworthy issue on that is that if this year's market price projected about $12.65, they're looking at fully $1.45 lower for next year, down to $11.20. So and then just would mention for wheat also, U.S. wheat numbers in essence up to 49, just under 50 bushels per acre yield, and weak exports continuing, 775 million bushels. And again, historically, when we've been good at exports, 1.1, 1.2, well, we're just declining because of lack of export competitiveness. And that's a nice word for saying, gosh, Russia is selling a lot of wheat and Ukraine isn't falling down. So flooding that world market with low-cost wheat, and it's affected what our price prospects are. So projection for U.S. wheat prices of $6 a bushel. We were at $7.20 this year, and given what's happened, absent a drought or geopolitical disruption over there in the Black Sea region that would stop shipments, it just seems that as long as low-cost, very competitive wheat keeps coming out of that part of the world, the U.S. is kind of a supplier of last resort. And for sorghum, I do have a quibble, a qualm, a disagreement with the USDA on sorghum. They basically raised the export number for sorghum from 240 million up to 295 million. Stock's about the same, but then drop the price from 485 to 440. My thought is, if we really have that great of a year in terms of sorghum exports, are we going to be dropping down to 440? Because in my view, when you've got that happening for sorghum, it doesn't completely separate itself from corn, but starts to operate more independently. So anyway, those are my thoughts on it. That the prices sure are sobering because they're all lower. And I don't doubt as producers, as lenders, other people in the ag industry look at that, they are wondering about how that'll affect financial returns. And I guess if we have lots of bushels at those prices, that's one thing. If we just have so crops at low prices, then that's a tougher pill to swallow and survive.
Dan, as we round out today's conversation, then wanting to think that these prices are still speculation and we'll have to wait and see what we're actually going to get when it comes to planting and harvest?
We're in February. February so often in past years has been a very non-volatile, almost a time of grain markets just being in the doldrums. And there's other more colorful words you could come up with to describe them. But seasonally, we're almost to March 1. For wheat, we'll break dormancy if we haven't already, and getting pretty near that with the temperatures we've been having out in western Kansas anyway. So we'll start to have more U.S. domestic production issues to deal with. As we speak, the USDA equivalent down in Brazil and also in Argentina have been talking about weather issues of late, even in Argentina, cutting back their numbers. So the USDA's approach to dealing with Brazil as South American crops is definitely Missouri-ish. Show me, that they're not making any cutbacks of major consequence until they have the proof. And we have now. And last factor is farmers at these low prices aren't selling unless they absolutely have to. So they're withholding sales from the market, and eventually that'll bring buyers to the table, and we'll see what that does as we head off into March, April, and May.
That was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking with another keynote speaker from the Women Managing the Farm Conference, Kim Bremmer. Kim, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Kim, could you tell us a little bit about your topic that you talked about with the attendees of the Women Managing the Farm Conference?
Well, we're talking a lot today just about the importance of speaking up in your voice in agriculture, how important it is to both connect with consumers, and also that we're making sure that we are the ones driving the narrative about agriculture, because we see a lot of policy that continues to roll downhill to the farm level, and we really have to be involved in that.
And when you're talking about sharing maybe that story of agriculture with others, you had an acronym that went along with it.
Yes, EASE, E-A-S-E. It's kind of a little crash course in communication. So the first E in the acronym is to engage, just make connections with people. But the A is the most important letter, and that's to acknowledge. We have to acknowledge that all consumer concerns are valid whether we agree with them or not. And there are little things that we can do so people feel heard. And inherently that's all anyone wants in communication anyway. So it's little things, because when someone says something about agriculture that we don't like, we tend to get very defensive. Sometimes we get mad. We puke our knowledge all over people. I mean, we have to stop doing that. We have to stop puking on people. So it's little things. You could say, hey, I'm glad you asked. Or I know there's a ton of misinformation out there, but on our farm we do this, or on farms we do this. I mean, this isn't just for farmers. It's for people involved in agriculture as well, because we all have this role and responsibility to speak up.
And on that portion of speaking up, might be having to repeat things a few times, even though it might feel repetitive and maybe a little annoying to those producers. It is important.
It is. Yeah, so we engage, acknowledge, share. That's where we talk about things in our perspective from our side of the fence. And then the final E in that acronym is to earn trust. But certainly, repetition is key. When people hear things enough times, it becomes the truth. And that really, I think, is where we get beat the most in messaging about agriculture, what we're doing, why we're doing it. We don't repeat ourselves enough. And the people opposed to what we're doing, they repeat themselves. all the time.
And there's a lot of different ways to share a farmer's knowledge with others.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it doesn't have to just be social media. I mean, obviously it's conversations, it's in person, it's social media, it's on farm events. Anytime you can bring people to a farm, whether you host a farm tour or a farm to table type event, so people can see it for themselves, experience it for themselves. And don't forget the importance of staying involved in politics. I mean, no one likes politics, but politics play a huge role in our future success because we're trying to drive innovation, not regulation. So if you're not at the table, you're probably on the plate, and there's a lot of truth to that.
And something you talked a lot about when talking about innovation and regulation was methane.
Yes, methane. We're taking a beating in messaging livestock producers because, we hear all the time that we're one of the primary causes of global warming and greenhouse gas emissions. And certainly, I mean, yes, methane is a greenhouse gas, but there's a lot lost in that story. Just simplest things, methane's part of a biogenic carbon cycle, so it actually gets recycled. It has a shorter half-life. CO2 goes into the atmosphere for thousands of years. Methane's there for about 12. And then essentially it oxidizes out and it goes to carbon dioxide that goes back into feeding plants, and the plants feed the cow. So, I mean, you can get the idea that this is a carbon cycle, the biogenic carbon cycle. We don't talk about that enough. And we also forget simple things, even CO2, it's plant food. And a lot of people haven't even heard that or thought about it that way. So our job as people who advocate for agriculture, whether you work in agriculture or you are a producer, is that we always, always, always have to be sharing our perspective from our side of the fence.
And as you're sharing that perspective, important to think that one person can really just make a big difference.
You can always make a difference. There really is this ripple effect in communication, and it really is just about reaching one person. And rarely does your message ever stop there. It's not something we can easily measure, and I know it gets frustrating sometimes, but it really is all about just reaching one. I'm a huge believer in grassroots, and one person can make a huge difference.
You shared an example of sometimes that when you respond to one person, though, you could also be responding to many people, especially in the comments on Facebook.
Yes, especially in social media as a whole. And so utilizing that acronym of, engaging, acknowledging, then sharing, I do that all the time. I encourage everyone to do that. If someone, has a contentious issue, you just always cause a break in the conversation. Say something as simple as, hey, I'm glad you asked, or I appreciate your passion on this issue. And then you share your perspective. But remember, especially with angry people online, you're not necessarily responding to them. You're responding to everyone who's reading in that feed because, let's face it, we are all creepers. You're responding to the people who are creeping on social media because we all do it. And at the end, the goal is you look like the more reputable source. And don't be afraid to take conversations offline, or if things get really nasty. I mean, you own your pages. You can block people whenever you want. There are no real rules.
So sharing your own information is important, but it doesn't always have to be everything self-generated either, correct?
Yes, correct. I think we forget about that a lot because it just becomes overwhelming. And, oh man, do I have to post, how many times should I post a week or a month, or I'm not doing a great job, or, we're hard on ourselves. But again, there's no rules, and just find pages and people that you like and reshare, repost. There's still a lot of people that can be reached in that way. You don't always have to reinvent the wheel. You don't always have to have your own content. That's one of the good things about social media, is that we can amplify each other's messages.
And kind of moving away from social media, but still an important place to share your messages, is with those organizations that producers are a part of.
Yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, I think there's a lot of, there are a lot of great organizations, but it's easy for especially government relation teams to get a little too far removed from the farm. Their expertise is in policy, and it might not be what you do every day. And I meet a lot of producers and people that get frustrated with their organizations, whether it's one that they are a member of or even a checkoff organization. And, I hear you and I share in your frustration, but the only way to change it is to be the change you want to see. So you have to be more involved. You have to go to the meetings. You have to get involved in your membership organizations. You have to be talking to your checkoff representatives, or better yet, getting on the boards, because they're only as good as what you are. And if you want the change, you have to be it.
Kim, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and maybe give a push for helping producers share their knowledge with others.
Yeah, absolutely. There's absolutely no one that tells your story better than you, and it's your legacy to share.
That was Kim Bremmer, who was a keynote speaker at the recent Women Managing the Farm conference. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by USDA's Rod Bain and USDA Chief Veterinarian Rosemary Sifford as she gives us an update on the highly pathogenic avian influenza.
When it comes to the current status of highly pathogenic avian influenza in our nation, the Agriculture Department's chief veterinarian recently offered a one-word response to state directors and commissioners of agriculture.
Still.
As in still around, according to Dr. Rosemary Sifford. This current outbreak of high-path AI actually began almost 2 years ago, and as of January of this year, was credited for the slaughter of nearly 82 million birds, mostly egg-laying poultry, in 47 states.
I think we've seen our surges and we've seen the troughs over the last couple of years. In the October, November, early December timeframe, we saw another surge. We are still very consistently seeing that the surges are associated mostly with direct introductions from wild birds, and it's when you have wild birds in your neighborhood.
Yet a silver lining can be found, thanks in part to improved biosecurity efforts of bird owners.
We are still seeing very low rates of farm-to-farm transmission, lateral spread.
Because of the long-term nature of this current high-path avian influenza outbreak,
we do have to really keep our watch up. I think in some cases we're seeing a little bit of fatigue, and we're all tired of this now, but it's really, really important that we keep the message up that biosecurity is still supremely important, particularly if there are wild birds in your neighborhood.
The chief veterinarian adds USDA and its Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service continues to review, evaluate, and adjust its response to HPAI cases as they are detected.
We continue to look at our stamping out policy as a whole and whether that's still the most effective policy for us to consider. At this time, that definitely is where we believe that we are.
In terms of what the rest of 2024 might look like regarding the trends towards a continued high-path AI outbreak,
we are still seeing detections in the wild birds. While the numbers are lower, they're still there. And so I would expect that as long as the migration comes back, at this point it seems like they're going to be carrying the virus. So I think we should be prepared for that as we move into the spring. There's a lot of work going on around what's going on with this virus and how is it persisting in the wild birds. Hopefully we'll learn more from that work and be able to use that to inform our procedures.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond with this week's weather update. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with a weather update with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Chip, it's been pretty warm outside, and are we going to continue to see that?
Pretty warm. That's an understatement to just how warm we really have been. When we look at the last several weeks, when we have temperatures in the 70s, which just thinking central Kansas, we've already been in the 70s about 3 or 4 days this month. That's 20 degrees above normal for our average highs, where we should be typically right around the upper 40s to around 50. And we technically don't really hit that 50 mark until the end of the month. So very, very warm. And we've also seen that in overnight lows. We just have not gotten cold. We did get to the single digits over the weekend. It was kind of a surprise for a lot of folks. But, our record lows are well into the negatives still for this time of year. So it's not unusual by any means. And we've had a really dry air mass in place that allows the temperature to warm up very warm and quickly in the mornings. And then at night, since the dew point's really low, our temperature can fall. And so we can get pretty cool at night still, but we've still been averaging about 10 to even 15 degrees above normal for our lows as well. And if we were to end the month right now, statewide, we'd fit right about that 7th to 8th warmest February on record. So we're going to end up likely in the top 10 and potentially even a top 5 or more, just looking at the forecast the next 7 days.
And is there something else besides the warm weather that has contributed to being so dry outside?
Yeah, we've had a lot of sun. For starters, a lot of sun, which after some dreary January days, I'm sure we're all appreciative of the sun, but the winds also returned, and we've had some breezy winds. Not significant wind. There hasn't been a lot of blowing dust or anything, but that's about to change.
So are we going to continue to see the warmth as we move forward?
Yeah, it looks like the forecast right now is for prevalent warm temperatures. We're going to see some 80s in south central Kansas early next week. And unfortunately, that warm of temperatures typically come from a southwesterly fetch, which is associated with a strong storm system that's going to emerge across the plains early next week. That's going to bring significant wind when we're that warm. We'll probably see 40, 50 mile an hour winds in western Kansas. And that's associated with this strong low that'll bring fire weather conditions with it, where we're going to have that kind of wind combined with that kind of heat. Typically means really low humidity, and so our wildfire risk is going to skyrocket early next week. And honestly, it's been gradually increasing. We've gone about 15 days without rainfall across the state, so or at least 1/10 of an inch of moisture, whether it fell as rain or snow. But with that, we'll see the fire risk substantially increase, and we're going to keep those warm temperatures. We're going to have a cold front middle of next week associated with that system. That'll switch the winds out of the north. Winds will briefly die down, but then we return to the southwesterly flow. We warm right back up in the following weekend and look at another potential dry system for the first weekend of March. So with active weather pattern, we just can't quite get that Gulf moisture northward, which isn't abnormal for this time of year, but we've definitely gone from wet extremes in January to dry extremes now, and kind of typical Kansas weather and climate. But it's also springtime in Kansas.
Is there hope for extended moisture maybe through the second part of March?
Yeah, it looks like right now with that system, that first weekend in March will bring a pattern change that will hopefully bring some more moisture northward from the Gulf. Set the pattern up for another one or two systems middle of March that will likely have more moisture. Obviously, a ton of details need to refine, but all the models are suggesting an above normal probability of moisture at this point. Hopefully we can hold that through. This is the time of year where we tend to see those changes or those forecasts for above normal moisture kind of get taken away from us just as we get closer to the event, and they tend to trend a little drier than what we'd expect just because we have stronger cold fronts than we would get, like, say, in April or May this time of year. And that tends to really scour the moisture and push it off in the Gulf. So models just don't tend to handle that very well. But that's some hope. We'll hold on to it. Right now, despite the above normal moisture, most of locations in the state are going to finish below normal for precipitation for February, and the topsoil has really dried out as a result.
Chip, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us our weather update.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.